Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise to offer my amendment that utilizes the Holman Rule to reduce the salary of EPA Administrator Michael Regan to $1. On his watch, Administrator Regan has used the EPA to impose Green New Deal policies such as electric appliance and EV mandates, power plant closures, strict regulations on American energy production, and environmental justice initiatives.
When the Holman Rule was originally put in place years ago, it was meant to identify people who had committed crimes, and we've had some of those that have been fired. It wasn't meant to identify people who had policy differences. Those are what elections are about. Anybody who suggested that on this side of the aisle that we were going to elect the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration, that the policies that they enacted were going to be things we supported, I think we're living in a different world.
In my home state of Colorado, out-of-touch Denver and Boulder leftists voted to reintroduce gray wolves. Since then, 10 wolves were reintroduced in December, and 8 have confirmed wolf livestock depredations and 6 separate incidents involving wolf attacks in Colorado just this month. My Trust the Science Act delists the gray wolf from the federal endangered species lists and returns the issue of the wolf management to states and tribal wildlife agencies.
Once again, Republican leadership has taken an opportunity to vilify an endangered species today here on this floor, to sacrifice it to their precious industry groups. Guns, oil, and polluters. That has come to be what the GOP stands for, at least in this Congress. Last summer, they rushed to the House floor with bills to increase the extinction risk of the lesser prairie chicken and the northern long-eared bat. Today, it is the iconic gray wolf. Do my Republican friends truly have nothing better to do with their time, with the time of this body? We should be working on issues that make a difference to everyday life in America. But this Congress has been mostly about Republicans fighting with each other in a circular firing squad, and the only time they seem to take a break from that is when they want to do something to enrich the wealthiest Americans, harm the environment, or now to kill wolves.
I rise in favor of my amendment, which would prohibit federal funding for the Countering Group Extremist Activity Working or implement any recommendations from the group. In 2021, Democrats and the Biden regime unjustly used January 6th to prop up this woke working group to provide cover for unjustly targeting members of our military. Under the Biden regime, DEI instruction and management has reached new heights that threaten to weaken the bond between America's armed forces and its civilian leadership and undermine our military effectiveness and readiness. All of our men and women in uniform deserve to have the best tools needed to carry out their mission to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Unfortunately, liberal ideology undermines this mission. In order to stand up to China, Russia, terrorists, our military needs to project strength, not cultural wokeness.
Mr. Chair, to be clear, January 6th was an attack on America, our democracy, and this institution which we have all taken an oath to serve. This shouldn't be controversial, but service members who swear an oath to the Constitution should not try to overthrow the United States government. My colleagues allege that the department's efforts to counter extremist activities unfairly targets conservatives. There's nothing in the Countering Extremist Activity Working Group's final report to substantiate that allegation, because violent extremism, regardless of its political or partisan leaning, is a danger to all of us and to this democracy. But there can be no denial that far-right extremism is surging across the country at a much higher level than that of left-wing extremism. A recent study showed that violent extremist acts in the United States were far more likely to be associated with far-right ideologies like white supremacy than for any far-left alternative. In fact, the level of violence perpetrated by right-wing extremists in this country is on par with, if not higher than, that of Islamist extremists. In our country, where service members have access to critical national security information and assets, individuals motivated by extremist ideologies can pose an outside threat to our national security when they move beyond fair and legal expression of contentious issues and into subversive or even violent actions.
It is past time we put America and Americans first. Joe Biden and his regime are shelling out benefits to illegal immigrants like Oprah Winfrey on her show. Everyone gets a vote. Everyone gets recognized, even if you're here illegally. In New York, aliens are receiving $53 million in free prepaid debit cards. In Denver, Colorado, aliens get 6 free months of housing. And now they want to hand them seats in Congress to buy their lifelong allegiance to the Democrat Party. Americans deserve to have their voices fully represented, not diluted by illegal aliens. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of this legislation, and I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this bill. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Thank you kindly, and it's always delightful to hear my friend from Colorado speak. One thing that I do want to point out, however, because there might be some students in the gallery today, is that there can be no illegal aliens and there can be no green card holders in Congress, because the Constitution very clearly specifies that you must have been a citizen for 7 years before you run for the House, and you must have been a citizen for 9 years before you run for the Senate, and you must be a born U.S. citizen in order to run for president of the United States, which some of the historians, as I think I mentioned before, attribute to Thomas Jefferson trying to write Alexander Hamilton out of the presidential sweepstakes. In any event, I think that my colleagues should probably relax with some of the hyperbole and exaggeration here. After all we're saying is let's keep doing what we've done since 1790 in the country. This is the way that the census and the reapportionment have always been run in the United States of America, and what they're proposing is obviously a radical departure from what the Constitution ordained.
On Michael Reagan's watch, the EPA has prioritized DEI over domestic energy, climate change over consumers, and EVs over our great economy. In a hearing with the Oversight and Accountability Committee, he was unaware that the EPA has never formally been authorized by Congress, something that someone who oversees an agency should know. Is it true that the EPA has never obtained formal legislation, authorization legislation from Congress? It's never been authorized by Congress.
EPA is not authorized by Congress?
I'm asking you.
I thought EPA was authorized by Congress.
Well, the EPA is not. The EPA has never been formally authorized by Congress. However, this agency has imposed over $1.3 trillion in regulatory costs since the Biden regime took office.
It's just shocking. You spend so much time with our regional staff and regional administration and Region 8 and have such productive conversations about how we're doing things for your district and your state, and then you take this microphone and you
I've also seen the coal plants that have been decommissioned in my state.
100% we should not
I've seen the energy regulations that have regulated my district into poverty.
You're spending time with my staff.
Sure.
In your district.
Of course I am. I have oversight over your staff, and I want them to answer. I want them to provide a service for the American people.
Complimenting them
but there
about
are
the
so much. Yes, there are some things that have been done well, but not everything.
100%
when we have $617 billion per year in rulemaking, that is absolutely absurd. In March of last year, the EPA Twitter account posted, quote, as a bicultural, bilingual, and bisexual woman, Iris deeply empathizes with communities at the intersection of overlapping crisis of injustice, hashtag climate change, and environmental racism, end quote. We cannot have the head of the Environmental Protection Agency claiming that even the environment is racist. This is, another season of all the questions are made up and none of the points matter. The American people want their government to work for them, not against them. This administration's Green New Deal regulations are increasing regulatory costs at a rate of $617 billion per year of rulemaking. Is that clear? $617 billion in just rulemaking alone. This isn't a bill that Congress is passing. It's just rulemaking by the agency itself. And if they continue at the Obama administration's regulatory pace, this will cost American families $60,000. It's time to put an end to governing by the Green New Deal, which is very much a scam. And the first step is to get rid of Administrator Reagan.
Anybody who suggested that on this side of the aisle that we were going to elect the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration, that the policies that they enacted were going to be things we supported, I think we're living in a different world. They're enacting their policy. Instead of doing these types of amendments, and I've opposed every one of them except one, instead of doing these types of amendments, what we need to do is, if we oppose them, get out and elect another president to get the job done. This doesn't do anything. If you could tell me that they had committed some crime, something that they didn't have the authority to do, then maybe we'd consider it. But I noticed on all of these things, there's an awful lot of Holman amendments that are going to be, and I'm only going to speak on one of them. Same message goes out for all of them. You don't do this because, frankly, I don't think we have the authority to do it.
Speaker, thank you very much. I'm about to yield to my friend, Ms. Meng from New York, but I'm inspired by the remarks of the gentleman from Wisconsin, especially about the word republic, which of course comes from res publica, the public thing. He happened upon a subject that's of a lot of interest to me because I wrote a paper about it when I was in 6th grade, the Pledge of Allegiance. It was written by a radical Baptist minister named Francis Bellamy. I'm not sure if the gentleman's aware of that, on the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the New World. And Reverend Bellamy, who was an abolitionist in Vermont, was concerned about the continuing salute of the Confederate battle flag in the southern states. And so he wanted to write a flag salute that would be unifying for the Union. And he wrote, "I pledge allegiance to my flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, with liberty and justice for all." And you notice what is not in there. He did not have under God. That was added in 1954 by Congress, several weeks after the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education. But in any event, I'm not quite sure what the relevance is of the gentleman's invocation of the Republic or of Ben Franklin and the famous vignette about him saying, if you can keep it. Ben Franklin was, of course, a big supporter of immigration to the country, although he did display an anti-German bias in some of his writings. But I'll tell you a little story about Ben Franklin that might be of relevance to what the gentleman's talking about. Apparently, because I just did a tour in Philadelphia with the Ben Franklin people up there, and we learned this wonderful story. He made a loan to a friend of his for $100, and then he recorded in his diary that this gentleman he made a loan to for $100, Josiah, was always disappearing behind a tree or a building whenever Ben came along. And he finally caught up with him and he said, "Josiah, you know, I loaned you $100, and I'm wondering, am I going to be able to get my principal back, or at least the interest?" And Josiah said, "Well, Ben, look, the $100 is well invested somewhere else, so you don't have to worry about that." And Franklin said, "Well, what about the interest?" He said, "Well, I forgot to tell you that it's against my religion to pay interest, so I can't pay you the interest." So Franklin said, "You mean to tell me it's against your principal to pay me the interest, and it's against your interest to pay me the principal?" And Josiah said, "Well, that's right." So Franklin said, "Well, I can see I'm not going to get either." Well, look, here our principles and our interests converge very much. The principles are set forth in the Constitution, which is we count everybody, and everybody is part of the census, and everybody is part of the reapportionment process. It's been like that since 1790. We don't need to start finger painting on the Constitution with this silly election year proposal. But it's also in our interests because, as my colleagues have said, this is a land that is built on immigration, except for the Native Americans who are already here and the people who were brought over as slaves. All of us are the descendants of immigrants to this country. Tom Paine said when he got to America in 1774, 2 years before the Revolution, he said, "This land, if it lives up to its principles, will become an asylum to humanity." Not an insane asylum, mind you. An asylum to humanity, a place of refuge for people seeking freedom from religious, political, and economic oppression. That's who we are. And every day I have in my office people from the hotel industry, people from the construction industry, people from the restaurant industry saying, we've got huge labor shortages. We need people in America. So I'm for a whole lot more lawful immigration to America, less unlawful immigration in America, like the deal that was worked out in the Senate that was rejected by the Republicans, and a lot less demagoguery about who we are as a country, because the census and reapportionment provisions in the 14th Amendment tell it all. This is a country that's for everybody, seeking opportunity and hope, willing to follow the law and follow our Constitution. With that, I will yield to the gentlelady from New York.
The so-called countering group extremist activity working has been weaponized and implemented to almost exclusively target Republicans, conservatives, and libertarians serving in the military. And yet, by its own metrics, it has been a massive waste of money and time. The Defense Department continues to spend large amounts of time and money to combat extremism, yet its own analysis of the situation shows that it's entirely unnecessary. In fact, fewer than 100 service members have been subject to the discipline due to engagement in extremist activities. That's only 0.005% of the approximately 2.1 million active and reserve personnel. Clearly, extremism is not the problem that my colleagues on the left and media outlets made it out to be. The United States military is tasked with one mission: maintaining mission critical readiness to protect the American homeland. Sowing our armed forces with divisive rhetoric designed to pit races and genders against one another is not only morally wrong, it poses a very real threat to our national security.
Yet the latest report from the Department of Defense Inspector General found that 78 service members were alleged to have advocated for the overthrow of the government in the past year alone. That is likely an undercount given reported challenges in gathering and compiling data across the military departments. Clearly, extremism in the military remains a persistent and serious issue, one that we should not take lightly, again, given the January 6th insurrection in which we know some service members and veterans participated. This fact alone should be deeply concerning to every single one of us in this chamber. Instead of taking this problem seriously, this amendment prohibits the Department of Defense from implementing recommendations designed to counter extremist activity in our military. This undermines unit cohesion, the readiness of our forces, and ultimately public trust in our military.
In 2009, the Obama administration upheld the decision to delist gray wolves when their Interior Secretary, Ken Salazar, a Democrat from Colorado, announced the decision at a press conference that the Fish and Wildlife Service decision to delist gray wolves was a, quote, a supportable one. Scientists have concluded that recovery has occurred, end quote. In 2011, Congress directed USFWS to reinstate a rule to delist the gray wolf in the Northern Rockies ecosystem. In 2013, the Obama administration proposed delisting gray wolves in the lower 48 states. In November of 2020, scientists and nonpartisan career employees at the Department of Interior once again found gray wolves were fully recovered and once again issued a rule that returned management of gray wolf populations to state and tribal wildlife agencies. Unfortunately, frivolous litigation was filed by the Defenders of Wildlife, Wild Earth Guardians, and other extremist groups, and an activist California judge subsequently pandered to these groups by vacating the 2020 rule and ultimately relisting the gray wolf by judicial fiat. State and tribal wildlife agencies have a proven record of successfully managing gray wolves. In fact, Montana's successful state management resulted in gray wolves being 500% above Fish and Wildlife Service recovery goals. Idaho's successful state management resulted in gray wolves being 700% above recovery goals. There are now, as estimated, up to 6,000 wolves in the lower 48. Furthermore, there are an estimated 7,000 to 11,000 gray wolves in Alaska, and there are an estimated 30,000 gray wolves in Canada. Again, an endangered species list success story. Let's do as my bill says, trust the bipartisan science, and pass this bill so we can finally delist the fully recovered gray wolf and focus scarce taxpayer funding on endangered species that actually need help being recovered. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield.
This bill is falsely named. It's called the Trust the Science Act. And it would legislatively delist the gray wolf in the Endangered Species Act in the lower 48. That is not something that is done based on science. It is something this bill would do by political fiat. The gray wolf is one of America's most iconic species. And while it is making a comeback, the science and the facts on the ground tell us that it still needs help. This bill would make it so that not a single gray wolf in the United States, in the entire country, would be protected by the Endangered Species Act. Yes, it is true that the Yellowstone, the National Park wolf reintroduction, is one of the great success stories of the ESA. We saw that as apex predators, wolves help to rebalance and revitalize vibrant ecosystems and flourishing wildlife populations in one of the crown jewels of our national park system. The ESA has kept the wolf from going extinct. We've gone from only several hundred wild wolves in America, and these were inhabiting northern parts of Michigan and Minnesota, to approximately 7,500 wolves today, with populations in at least 11 states. That is the ESA in action. It's a great success story, but that doesn't mean that we can just unfurl a banner and declare mission accomplished. And certainly not when folks who took wolves to the brink of extinction are ready to rev up the wolf-killing machine once again and put us right back on that path to extinction. Wolf numbers have grown in the western United States, but the ESA rightly requires more than just population counts for delisting. Otherwise, we can quickly devolve right back to where we started. There are still a lot of factors that go into species recovery: habitat destruction, disease, the regulatory and recovery efforts by states that would have to take over management of the species if it is delisted, and a lot more. So the ESA requires that the Fish and Wildlife Service use the best available science to assess all of this, not just population numbers, before they make any delisting decisions. And importantly, the Fish and Wildlife Service must consult with tribes. Right now, the service is following these processes and developing a recovery plan. But if this bill was signed into law, all of that would be skipped. They would have to ignore any scientific evidence of remaining threats to the wolf. And this is the danger of legislatively delisting a species. While I believe my colleagues are capable of going onto Google and pulling up some population numbers on gray wolves, it is pretty brazen to suggest that they, as members of Congress, are more qualified than the scientists and experts with years of training to determine if a species is actually recovered.